Okay.
And I'm assuming we're starting with the agenda that I sent around, just to, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super.
Um,
So
go
you go
ahead,
ahead.
Anne.
You go first.
Okay. Well, really just a word before I pass it to Anne to welcome everyone. Great to have you. Some faces that have been here regularly, some new faces, and we'll have a chance to go around and speak with each other. But important moment to be together and to share these thoughts on reflective lawyering, on social justice, and on what we can do to advance all of that within our own lives and work. So, and delighted to have Michele. Maybe just a quick word about Michele, just off the top. Um, for those of you who missed part one, Michele is a community. She has a long history in the work of community lawyering. She also did a PhD on reflective practice. She is a visiting scholar at, and I'm forgetting the name, Queen's College, right?
University.
Queen's University Law School. Her PhD work, which we linked to in the announcement for today, laid the foundation for a crowdsourced book about reflective lawyering. She's also the proud and grateful mother of 3 daughters. And she's a deep thinker on questions of social justice, on bringing our reflective capacities to that work. And we were just talking before we officially started about the work she's doing on Indigenous legal orders and a retreat that she's hosting very soon for law students to look at Indigenous legal order and social justice and reflective lawyering. So great welcome to Michele for part 2 of her time with us here. And over to Anne Friedman to lead a kind of an opening go round.
Yes. Although I don't think Michele is hosting this retreat. I think she's just attending it. I don't want to up her responsibilities just a few days before it begins.
Thank you.
We thought that we would have a go round where people could say a factor in your being supported in reflection and reflective inquiry. So it could be anything, a movie, a book, a person, a course, an experience, as a way to presence each of our own reflective experience into this conversation. So I will call on people, and I will call on Ken first.
Thank you. Well, I missed the first session, and I'm embarrassed to say I'm not really up to speed enough on the topic to give a sensible answer. So I'm here to learn, and maybe by the end, I can understand well enough and respond appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you. Kim.
Well, certainly Peter Gavel has been influential on reflecting on my justice work. I think most people here, but not everybody, knows I'm not a lawyer, but I do. I'm an artist and I do creative justice work, and I'm also an organizer. Um, and But aside from diving into Peter's work, I would say also Thomas Merton, Richard Rohr, um, and there are various things that sort of connect the reflective work to the active work, such as for me working with Pax Christi, and other organizations that I participate in that sort of interweave the reflection with what do we do about it.
Thank you. Harry.
Well, I'm looking forward to this part 2 so I can better understand part 1. I have unfortunately nothing to say in response to your inquiry, Anne, but hope to learn more as we go along.
Thank you. Stu.
Yes, hello. I just finished a Zoom where this is on my mind, and I think it's very, very reflective. The old Rumi poem, beyond the idea of rightness and wrongness, there is a field, and I will meet you there. Rightness and wrongness is the duality we've been living in, and beyond that is the field of love where we're all connected. And that is the responsive area. And I will meet you there. I love you all in that
Thank
field.
you. Yeah,
Over and out.
yeah. Thinking about Zoom as a field is a
Yeah.
funny
My
thought.
love is a field.
Yes, absolutely. Duncan.
So yeah, I'm Duncan Holloman up here in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and I think your question, Anne, was about what provides support or motivation or guidance within the fields of reflective practice. Yeah.
Yes.
So I've been around in that territory for a long time, and so I would say that my work as a psychotherapist is very much about self-reflective practice, becoming aware of what's going on inside. I couldn't do this work unless that was a foundational principle. I would also say that I host a group connected with my church, a weekly group on contemplative practice. So I also teach in meditation and contemplative practice.
Thank you. Lisa.
I'm really struggling to figure out what my what my answer would be because I'm not sure. But I do think my awareness does come from ongoing work, probably with therapists and coaches and yoga and other practices, although I'm not thinking about it that way. And I definitely was very influenced by the various liberation theology, liberation pedagogy, liberation psychology when I was doing a lot of field work in Latin America, which I think kind of got me thinking about reflecting.
Thank you. Martha.
Hi, thank you, Stuart. That was really beautiful. I am a colleague of Nanette's from a long time ago in legal services, and after that worked with women in prison about their rights to their children, and then for a long time was at a public policy think tank called the Center for the Study of Social Policy. So I didn't do any direct service there, and I just left and am now doing some about to do some work in Pennsylvania, going back to working with parents who are incarcerated. And so I feel very much like I'm going back to needing to do more self-reflective work around that work because it is so much so that and so that's why I'm here.
Thank you. Jenny. You're muted.
Okay. Hi. So I'm very happy to be here. I've had a chance to meet Michele in person recently at Queen's. So I'm a just retired law professor, and though not a lawyer. And I would say my resources are meditation, Buddhist-inspired meditation, but also I'm immersing myself in a lot of literature that ranges from indigenous law to many different kinds of scholarly approaches to rethinking the human-earth relationship.
Thank you. Rachel.
I think I came in after the question was posed. Could
The
I get the,
Yes, the question is, what inspires you, supports you, motivates you in your reflective practice?
I would say my community. Um, if, because I believe that my community is in a way, a reflection of myself. So if I feel like I'm not necessarily getting good things, then I start to do some inner work of like, wait a minute, it's bringing it back to me and that, but then also in my community in the context of they are my consistent reminder. I feel like I'm constantly surrounded by people who are doing better work than me or who are better than me in a context. And so they're often inspiring me and pushing me forward to continue the work that I do.
Thank you. Nanette.
I think a big source of first of all, just wonderful to hear everybody sharing. I really appreciated it. For me, I think a lot is trying to connect my ideas with the practice, and a real source of inspiration for me has been, as for some others here, both Peter Gable and Michael Lerner, who also passed away this year. And their understanding of social justice from a sort of a spiritual perspective, and also the way that they spoke, that they took that understanding and applied it to their work in the real world. And I always appreciated that, and it's always been a source of inspiration for me. um, Very much more recently, someone else who kind of reflects that as well, that sense of deep empathy and bringing it into activism, is somebody by the name of Peter Beinart, who is a scholar on Middle East and Israel Palestine and current world situation. And I've just found his insights very, very helpful in my own reflection.
Thank you. So I agree, Nanette, these are wonderful. It's wonderful to meet people through this lens of what people are sharing. It's very nourishing already. And I just want to throw in a Quaker meeting and Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way, and a personal growth workshop I did called the Essential Experience Workshop. And Julia Cameron and the Essential Experience Workshop put me on the path of journaling, which is one of the major resources that I rely on. And I would draw some from almost what everybody has said so far. So I think we are the right people gathered today for Michelle's presentation. So Michele, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing, and again to Nanette and Anne for orchestrating these two events. So much appreciated, and to all of you for what you've just shared. I do want to say too, when I was thinking about today and what I might say about who inspired me, I also came to Peter Gable's 2014 article on the spiritual dimension of social justice. And there's a synergy with the Indigenous Legal Orders workshop that we're doing this week, because one of the people, Canadian academics we had to read, made an analogy between Indigenous worldviews and Peter Gable's work in that article, which I thought was a very interesting and moving synergy for me, or serendipity, or whatever you want to call that. And I would, particularly in that article, I had mentioned this to Nanette before the call. He writes about affirmative action and it as a redemptive and healing activity for people who've been unjustly oppressed, and how its impact got narrowed when it was almost became a legal concept of just discrimination and anti-bias work. I found that very helpful in the light of the challenges that are being faced at the moment around so many different things that we're holding sacred as a better way of living with one another. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that before we get into it. And now I'm going to try and screen share. We'll see how that goes. Right now, can everyone see this slide? Because I can't see you when I see the
Yeah,
slides.
no.
Yeah, remember that from last
Mhm.
time. At least that's my ineptitude perhaps with technology, but here we go. And thank you for your kind introduction. The first thing I want to do is acknowledge the territory that I am on with
Michele,
grad.
sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
we can't see your slides at all.
Okay, so I don't know why that would be, but let me just get out of them for a moment and start again with what I was doing. Okay, I'm going to try sharing. Oh, it wants that instead. Okay. Can you see them now?
No. Oh, yes, here they come.
There we go. So let me, oh,
Not,
that's,
yes, there we go.
okay. So it's even more bizarre the way it appears to me at the moment, but that's okay. We'll get into that.
I don't know if you can blow it up or change
Yeah, I'm just doing it.
the
Sorry.
view.
It's
Yeah.
not,
Okay.
hang on. Get,
Great.
there we
Yeah.
are. So here we are. Here we are. And I'm just going to acknowledge with gratitude the territory that we're on. So I'm grateful to live, learn, research, write, and present as an invited guest on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people here in Kingston, Ontario. And in gratitude for this gift, I am committed to answering the calls for truth and reconciliation in our country with our First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people through my work, particularly my work around reflection. I just was going to do a little bit of a review about what we covered last time, anticipating that there might be a few new people this time. So I'll just do it at a really high level. I'm not going to sort of speak about how I came to it or all the benefits of reflective practice that would be available in the first recording. And I also want to thank Duncan for being in touch with me since the last time. I found his questions to me to be very, very helpful. And I was inspired to learn about his work on organizational development and psychotherapy, and thinking about how some ideas from those areas of work are completely connected to the work that I'm trying to do about reflective practice. And it brought up for me, just the different ways that we might work together, bringing expertise from our particular fields about how to encourage reflection and how important they are. One of the ways I did come to reflective practice was as an executive director of a legal clinic within a system of 70 legal clinics in Ontario, trying to think about how we could share knowledge better, how we could create more change, how we could be more efficient. And that brought me to writers like Peter Senge and Fifth Discipline, and all those ideas about reflection that are embedded in that work, and other people who've written about organizational learning and single and double and triple loop learning, all very important ideas about learning when work-based learning and working within organizations for change. I found all that very helpful. And of course, as some of you have mentioned too, psychotherapy and therapeutic kind of interventions are also very helpful in the self-reflective domain, and absolutely essential, because of all the domains of reflection that I'm going to talk about in just a second here, self-reflection, I think, is probably the one that historically has been the least promoted or supported within law schools. More so it's more so done within clinical legal education programs, but not normally in the mainstream curriculum. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is sort of complexify and deepen our understanding of reflection. So last time we talked about the different, what I've called the different domains of reflection. So there are really reasons why, or domains within which we're trying to create change. And the most conventional one, the most instrumental one in the literature about professional learning across all the professions, again, less so in law because we're only about 30 years behind the other professions, is the reflection on practice idea, and reflection on learning, and how we learn through learning, how we learn through reflecting on learning, how we learn through our work and our experiences, and how we build professional knowledge by integrating the things that we learned, the technical things that we learned in law school, with what's required from us in practice. And it's how we develop professional knowledge about how to be the kind of legal professional that we are. Self-reflection is a domain about reflecting on values and self and ethics and what motivates us, what energizes us. Critical reflection is huge in law, although it's not always recognized that way by people in other professions, interestingly enough. And in the literature, critical thinking in law is not usually connected to critical reflection. Actually, particularly in the US literature, I might say, which has been an interesting thing to think about, because we are asked to be critically reflective about law and about systems at law school, about cases, about so many different things. We're introduced, or we were introduced, I'm not sure where this is going to sit going forward, to ideas like critical race theory, feminist theory, for example, as ways of problematizing, and critical legal studies, of course, going back to Peter Gabel's work, as ways of interrogating what we know and understand and believe to be true. And integrative reflection is a way of bringing together ideas that we might have, critical ideas that we might have. For example, feminist theory, how does that influence how we practice in our professions? And is there always a disconnect at all between feminist ideals, for example, and feminist theory and how we actually practice as legal professionals? That would be an example of the questions you might be asking yourself when you try to integrate the different forms of reflection. And then collective reflection is really something we're engaged in today, and PISLAP members are always engaged in during their events and retreats. And it's our capacity to reflect together, which, as I was saying to Duncan in our email exchange, without having a good capacity for self-reflection, it's sometimes difficult to engage in more collective reflection or even reflection on learning. So it's a quick summary of what we did, and this is just a diagram that I've used for many years to think about how we need to integrate critical reflection with how we practice, with who we are as people, and that it supports our collective reflection. And I very much believe, without getting into all the benefits for us at this stage of our lives, it's really about authenticity and professional integrity, and I might say at this point, finding hope. In a very difficult very difficult world. I also want to emphasize how it's very much a journey, and it's a very much an incremental piece. And I know it can be overwhelming at first to think about the domains, and I'm going to overwhelm you even more by talking about other ideas of reflection today, because our goal today is to deepen our understanding from last time. And it's very much iterative. And one thing I found out when I was interviewing the 50 plus legal educators in Australia and Canada about why they encourage reflection is that by far, I think everybody except for one or two, and those one or two were very advanced in their thinking about reflective practice in their writing, and in discussions I had with them, everyone said that their understanding of what reflection is and what reflective practice is has completely intensified since they started on that learning journey. So they had one understanding at the beginning, and their understanding now is much different. So it's for everybody, and for me too. It's been a very incremental and iterative journey, and very much developmental, which is also why I've got this diagram, this arrow here, about understanding its complexity and its deepening. And really the reflective muscle does underlie everything that we learn. And I know in medical education, they talk about the lack of reflective capacity actually being a professional impediment and danger to people in the practice of medicine, that non-reflective practitioners, they've shown with studies anyway, are problematic. And I think we might say the same thing about law, even without having conducted any official studies on that. It does seem to be the case. So very much an iterative journey of reflective learning, you might call it in law school, developing the capacity for reflective inquiry. And one of my pieces is to say we learn a lot about advocacy, and sometimes it's counterposed to reflective inquiry. And I've experienced those barriers, even in my own work in a community law practice, community lawyering, where people our own colleagues sometimes tend to advocate against new ideas and new ways of doing things, as opposed to being curious about what might be possible to think about things differently and how we're doing things to become more efficient and effective. And this again leads us into more reflective practice, both as a noun and reflective practices as verbs that we do, with the idea that we're moving always towards a vision of reflective professionalism. And this is a more complicated piece I'm not going to get into today, but it will be there in the slide presentations for people to think about. And that is explaining, and it was in the handout originally, in more detail what I mean by each of these different domains of the instrumental part of reflecting on practice, moving into more transformative ways of reflecting, which include our self-reflection, critical reflection, integrating them, and being able to reflect better together to create new visions and ideas, which I think very much is what PISLAP has been about since its inception. Rereading things off the website, rereading some materials in Marjorie Silver's excellent book that she had put together in 2015 to document developments. So I wanted to say today a little bit about other ideas about reflective practice. Obviously, I fastened on the domains in my research. It's what came to me one Sunday morning, that there were all these different domains after reading reflective practice literature for a year or two when I first started. But there are other ways of thinking about reflection that you might be more familiar with. One is the sort of temporal aspects of reflection. In other words, ideas of reflecting on action or after action. And Donald Schoen wrote about, who was the original progenitor of the term reflective practice, he wrote about how we reflect during action and we don't even realize it. And he's given some examples from law too. But people since then have talked about how, well, no, there's actually also anticipatory reflection. So reflection in advance of taking action, which I think we can all probably identify with. So there's reflecting before action, during, which is kind of an implicit process. We don't even realize we're doing it, but it's part of what makes us professionals, that we're able to do that in a courtroom or wherever. We're able to respond to the stimulus of the moment and do something because of the professional knowledge we've built up about how to do things and how to think about things and how to argue, and in the case of cases, for example. And then the reflection after action is all the debriefing things we might do after we've had an experience of some kind, or won a court case, or lost a court case, or dealt with a challenging client or situation. But one idea that I'm finding very inspiring now, particularly in the environment that we're in, but it's also held my fascination for about 15 years now, is the idea about future forming reflection. And that's been written about by a few authors, but it's very much about reflection in the realm of the possible and what else might be possible in the future. And Nanette and I were discussing before the call Otto Scharmer's work and what he's done with Theory U. He's at MIT, and how he's written about the importance of presencing, being present, and also sensing future action and the technology ideas that go along with that. I have found that very inspiring, and his writing about the future that depends on us to bring it into being, which I think is an important message for these times. And one of the things I'm going to do is get back to following him, Otto Scharmer, that is, and his ideas. Yeah, I think he very much builds on the early writing, even by John Dewey, which also influenced Donald Schoen, about open heart, open mind, and open will. So that's temporal aspects. There's also issues of reflective depth. And that would be ideas of being sort of non-reflective, reflective, and a critical reflector are some of the ideas. Some people talk about sort of descriptive writing, descriptive reflection, the capacity for dialogue, again, in critical, or rapid reflection, repairing reflection, reviewing reflection, research to support reflection, and re-theorizing and reformulating ideas of inner and outer. Reflection are also part of the different foci for reflection, or anyway, there's many different foci for reflection also that are part of that. That inner outer is one of them I mentioned. Then there's different dimensions of reflective practice, and I think those are more holistic ideas about reflection. This ties back into ideas of embodied reflection, aesthetic reflection, affective reflection, understanding the impact of emotions. Embodied is very much the mind-body connection. I think about here too how contemplative practices, which unfortunately we're not going to engage in today, but I wish we could, because I found them very supportive of reflective practice in particular. very much about the mind-body connection brought to our attention through contemplative practices. And aesthetic and intuitive work. We'll do a little aesthetic exercise today. And the idea, I think, in this case, of reflexive spiraling of being and becoming and meaning making through reflective practice. There's lots written about that. And structured learning cycles is yet another idea. And that would be your Kolb learning cycles, if you're familiar with that at all, and I'm going to review some of those. So I'll come to that back in a second. They might be ones you're more familiar with, having been introduced to. In law, Timothy Casey has written about structured learning cycles in 2014, in the case of clinical legal education. And then there's orientations to reflective practice, which is another way people have thought about it. And I'll just mention these ideas from education because people haven't written about this in law, but I think there's analogies to how we think about practicing our profession. But people have written many different things. I'll just give you a couple of really obvious examples about liberal, conservative, and socialistic approaches to reflective practice in education. You could think about the same thing in law, or progressive, conservative, social justice, or spiritual contemplative approaches to reflective practice in teaching. And I think we're going to do another exercise that thinks about our orientation to legal practice or to how we use law in a few minutes to give you an example. So there's many different ideas in addition to the ones, and they overlap, of course, with the ideas that I have mentioned, but this is how rich a concept it is. And then last time, this slide I put up and said, we're not going to go through all these, but what I did was identify in my research, which focused on law students in the university legal education sphere, I had identified about 15 methods that legal educators were using to build the reflective muscle or reflective capacity of students. And then I modified them a little bit for our group. And we use reflective questioning in the context of what we're doing today or will. We've talked about contemplative practices. We're going to have an example of aesthetic practices in a moment. And I think just the very existence of an interest group like PISLAP is actually a very important reflective method. The community, we heard mention of community helping to support us reflect by a couple of you before this. The idea of critical or soul friends, I just mentioned because I find it intriguing and I could answer what that is in response to questions. And the idea of retreats, and I'll mention something about action research because in our professional lives that's important. Let me just regroup for a minute and make sure I haven't forgotten anything. So this is just an example of structured learning cycles. Yes, so Duncan was reminding me of the importance of Kolb's learning cycle and how we develop our learning through reflection, having an experience and reflecting on it, thinking about theories and ideas and then trying new ways of doing things. I can't remember where I got the personal development planning graphic from, which I should figure out, but it's a very simple questions. What do I need to do to be able to do? What can I learn? I'm going to implement something and then I'm going to reflect on what I've learned and how it's benefiting my practice. It's very similar to Kolb's. And then Gibbs' learning cycle, I think, brings in the impact of emotions, as I recall. And there's even a simpler one from many years ago. Now, how many years does that ago? 55. Oh my goodness. Rolf's what, so what, and now what are just examples of ways that we can ask ourselves, questions in a cycling sort of session. So I wanted to bring, because you might be more familiar with some of those and not even realize it. And then I very much have believed that, and I've written about it, about how action research is critically important for lawyers, particularly in the area of social justice and access to justice work, where you don't necessarily know the answer to a question. You have a theory maybe or a thought about how something might change, and you delve into an approach. And then you sort of plan it out and you figure out, how you're going to monitor whether things are working or not. And you will engage in a constant cycle of reflection because you may need to change your strategy partway through when you discover your assumptions are wrong. So you're always evaluating it and then coming up with new ideas about how to do things. So I have found that personally incredibly important in my work, and I do see it very much as being something in the toolkit of the reflective practitioner. So I'm going to go back for half a second here. So what we're going to do now is delve over and into thinking about some reflective activity examples. And what I'm going to do here is have us think about, and we won't do much sharing on this one, maybe on the next one we will, we'll just see, because you can always raise, we have time for questions at the end. You can always raise issues or share comments back if you're comfortable after we've gone through some of these ideas. One of the things that I found sort of missing in law, even though there's lots of really interesting things to read, is that nobody ever asked me what my theory of action was or my philosophy of practice as a lawyer. Like, what was it? What was I going out to do and how was I going to do it? What were my underlying assumptions about how I was going to be in the world and how did they impact on the way I practice law? Yeah, I hadn't read anything about that, shockingly. It's a long time ago that I was in law school, to be fair, but I'm not so sure. Anne can probably comment on whether there's a lot of reading that happens in the context of this. Again, we know that many members of this group have advanced a lot of ideas about how we might practice law differently, which I'm going to mention some of them because they've been so influential. But what I have up on the screen right now is something from some Australian folks who were writing about legal ethics in a study they'd done that sort of looks at different ideas about how people are acting. And this is just one very simple example. And I just ask you to think about, as we look at this slide and the next one, and listen to some of the terms I'm going to read out about different philosophies or ways of thinking about lawyering, which might resonate with you. One of the things I'm working on is a reading list about all of these, just from people that I've discovered, but many of them you probably were already exposed to if you've read Marjorie Silver's books or Kim Wright's books, for example. So in this particular case, it was a traditional idea of adversarial advocate. And responsible lawyering is also a more traditional view, I think, that we've been influenced by, at least in our rules of professional conduct up here. Those might be two that we would have been thinking about with law. And sorry, I must say, we tend to default to our rules of professional conduct as determining how we're going to practice law instead of looking at what our underlying ideas are about how to practice law and what we believe and aligning our values with our practice of law. So moral activism was one of the trends that they identified, as well as an ethics of care. And many will see the relational lawyering connection to that and feminist ideas of lawyering as connecting to ethics of care. So those are some examples that you might think about. I think our paradigms of lawyering are actually expanding, even though our rules of professional conduct and your American equivalent, the name of which I've forgotten at the moment, might do. There's actually far richer ideas. And I have to say, many of them come from people connected to PISLAP. When you think about it, you can sort of read that circle if you want to, but I'm going to read some other ones. So we talked about relational. People have written about democratic lawyering, climate conscious lawyering, integrative lawyering, holistic and holistic defense, collaborative lawyering, of course, we know so much about with this group, facilitative, client-centered, movement lawyer, and emancipatory, humanistic, community lawyering, which we've mentioned, creative problem solving, therapeutic jurisprudence, restorative, comprehensive, law is a healing profession, lawyering as peacemaking, trauma-informed, culturally competent, unitive justice, and feminist ideas and ethics of care are just some of them. So I just ask people to think for a few minutes about whether any of those have resonated with you. There's even more up there, actually. When I look at public interest vocationalism, there's a few more. Aiken's concept of justice readiness and what that means. There's so many. Preventative law is another one that's not up there. Appropriate dispute resolution ideas and practicing that way. So they're wonderful ideas there that I think we could benefit from examining a little bit more closely. I'm just going to take a quiet moment here as you're thinking about that, and then we're also going to advance to the next activity. And I will say on the slide deck that will be available afterwards, I have slides that are hidden here that you can't see because I know it's an awful lot of material and can overwhelm people, but there'll be more things listed in the slideshow that you do see than what we're going to go through now. I did read, by the way, I am reading right now an article about anti-democratic lawyering, which is the inverse. I've told you all the positive ones, but there, of course, are other ones, more traditional ideas of advocacy. And then this, which was a critique actually on anti-democratic lawyering, which I think is reflecting on some of the things that are happening at this very moment. Yeah. So now we're going to segue into another activity that's kind of related. And so this is an idea in about fostering reflection in the domain of self-reflection and using a poem to try and surface some of our ideas about who we are and what we're doing in the world. So for this one, I thought I might just read it out and show it to you on the next slide. And then we could just take a few quiet moments to think about that poem and what it brings up for you. And it may not resonate with all of you. That's the other thing I want to say, which is why I think people's individual reflective practices need to be so different, because not everybody finds poetry of any kind to be helpful, or art, or reflective journaling, or any of the myriad of techniques you saw on the other slide, the 15 categories, to be helpful for them. And sometimes it's helpful for us to challenge ourselves with new ways, and other ways it's best to just go with what we're comfortable with. And we could hear the diversity of approaches when we did the go round at the beginning. So here's the poem. And as I said, we're going to take a couple of minutes. We're going to take a couple of minutes to go through, to give you a chance to sort of think about it, maybe circle something or write down something that appeals to you. And then if people would like to share afterwards, I think Anne they could share in the chat, or you could share orally, and I'll ask for Anne's help with that. So there's a thread, The Way It Is by William Stafford. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. When you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you can do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. So I invite you to just reread it there on the screen. Hopefully you can all see it, and maybe, think about a sentence that might resonate with you, or how it relates to you, or what thread you might be following. So we'll just take a couple of quiet minutes with that. Let me just put my timer on for 2 minutes to allow people to reread it and be thinking about it. take another few seconds just to. And just I invite you, if you're comfortable, to share something in the chat, which I can't see, by the way, with this view of my screen. Let's just see if I can bring it up, or share orally if you're comfortable. Anything that speaks to you from here. It can either be about the thread or anything else about the poem itself, or reflecting using a poem.
So this is Duncan. I'm happy to jump in. Bill Stafford is probably my favorite poet in the world, and so it's just lovely to see this poem that I know quite well. And it reminded me of another poem that I put in the chat called "Ask Me." The last line of which is, "What the river says, that's what I say." And I just love that. And it's perhaps relevant to the conference that you're going to be, well, the course that you're going to be taking about how the land speaks to us.
Jenny.
So I'll just pick up on what Duncan said, because we actually, my two collaborators at Queen's, both of whom will be at this event, we read a book about listening to a river by somebody who spent 2 years doing that. And so it's not a glance, right? We most of us don't know how to listen to the river. We don't know what it's saying, but one can learn. And it takes time. It's a process. And so I have to say, I much preferred the poem that Duncan put up. The one that you put up, I had a lot of resistance to, because it suggests there just is that thread, and it doesn't change. And maybe at some ultimate existential level that's true, but I think a lot of our lives is finding the thread, and maybe even choosing the thread. And so that process shifts.
So interesting, both your reflections, so much. Because I have to confess, I have nobody else, but I feel like this stage in my life is actually about weaving a tapestry with the threads. It's not just one thread, although there's probably something at its core, but there is something at its core, but it is multiple threads, right? And changing ones. And yeah, so interesting. I love it. And I'm loving that book about the river, by the way, because I've been reading it too, because it's one of the readings for the course. Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Lisa.
Yeah, just to add, it's interesting because so both poems are really thought-provoking, but this one in particular actually resonated because more than ever, with everything going on with Trump, I'm realizing that I have a thread that I've always had, which is an orientation through justice, to justice, and that that is my core, and it shows up in every place that I find myself, and in the way that I perceive and reflect and react and lead. And so in many ways, this resonated because I think more than anything, I've just realized that that's always going to happen no matter where I am. And that's how I read this poem.
Oh, thank you so much for that too. And I'm just thinking one thing we'll want to do, Nanette, is be sure we save the chat too, so that we have that I have that to look at afterwards, because that's really helpful for me. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah.
And it looks like Kim has her hand up.
Yes, I didn't see it. Good, Kim.
So I wound up with really ambiguous thoughts about the thread. I on one hand, didn't want to trust that the thread was a good thing, because what if somebody goes through their entire life and they never consider whether the thread is really what they thought it is or not? And they just go through their whole life saying, well, that's the way it is. And they shouldn't have done that. And they should have considered other things. And then I think of also St. Teresa's bookmark, where she talks about how everything changes, but God doesn't change. And how that was a core thing in her life that kept her spirituality stable and kept her strong. And I think for me, there is the faith, and there's also the sense that that love is the undercurrent of all justice. And am I willing to let go of that thread? No. You know, and aren't there some threads that are a good thing? So I wound up really tugging with, is it good to have a thread like that? Or is it something that should be reconsidered to have a thread like that?
Mhm. So helpful again. And when I think about the role of reflective practice, part of the role is to figure out what those threads are and to tug on them and to interrogate them and question them, right? Like it's very much that sort of stance, a reflective stance on life doesn't keep things where they are. It's constantly morphing and changing, and interrogating, right? With new ideas. So helpful to hear everyone's reaction to this. Thank you.
There's a long post in the chat from Ken who talks about the thread as the God of our understanding, and Boehm's theory about the implicate order, and how his understanding is if we align with the implicate order, we can find the interconnection among all things. And then there's the idea of the holographic universe, and biocentrism. And Ken, it's not a book about the river, it's a poem that Duncan put in the chat,
Oh,
also by
okay.
William
Thank you.
Stafford. So if you
Great.
scroll up in the chat, you
Thank
can
you. I
find
missed that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
I
there
see
is a
it.
book about listening to the river that Jenny was referring to.
Oh yeah, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, she might want to pop it into the chat. It's a Canadian author who spent 2 years listening to the river. So it's a super interesting book, and very, again, poetic and unusual, I might say. Yeah.
So I wanted to say about the poem that I was struck with the sentence, while you hold it, you can't get lost. And so the idea of whether there's an action of you holding it that is needed, that's related to what everybody else has been saying about reflection, or whether it doesn't require action, and that there's things that you've come here to work on and to work you. And so to some extent it's and it may make a difference how hard you work and how much you do. And if we are given other lifetimes, whether there's more you have to do in the next lifetime because you weren't able to do so much in this lifetime. But I'm not sure anybody can get lost. You might feel lost, but I'm not sure anybody is ever lost.
Interesting. So helpful. And I don't know if there's any more comments or not, but I know that we were wanting to leave a time for questions too.
Ken has his hand up.
Okay.
Lisa also has her hand up, and so maybe you're just not, you don't?
She's
Well,
done.
you're done. Okay. Um, thanks for taking note of my comments in the chat. I didn't speak out loud because there's a significant sense of I may not know what I'm talking about. So I'm just sort of taking a little toe in the water approach. But I'll just sort of try to summarize a little bit of what I was thinking by saying that I'm interested in trying to study the intersection between what quantum physics is teaching us and the spiritual systems and domains that we're probably more familiar with than quantum physics, and how the possibility of putting those two together and finding their intersection can create a more unified sense of the whole in the spiritual and apparent physical level together. Because I use the word apparent because if I understand at all the Bohm's theory of the implicate order, what we see and experience as the physical level is more of an apparent uh, apparent phenomena than actual. I'll leave it at that because I've already said more than what I really know what I'm talking about.
It says also aligns with indigenous worldviews, but anyway, more than humans and so many other ideas connected to that. Oh, it's just so inspiring. I'm just putting the next slide up so you know that it's there. So I've just given you some examples of the way we might nurture different domains, but here are other ones, again, for reading later. And now we were going to move into a section where you might have questions, or there are things that you might respond to in these questions. And we have just under 10 minutes, I think, for this part. And then I'll have a couple of last words. And then so will our hosts and Annette.
I just want to interject to welcome Eve from Uganda, where she's involved with a unit of justice school that has been established in Uganda. And since she came in late in the process, I just want to acknowledge that she has joined us.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, there's a lot of things in the chat. Is there anything else there, Anne, we need to be aware of? I'm seeing 17 things in the chat that I can't read, but
no, that's mostly Ken's long post, and then Eve says thanks me for acknowledging that she's here, and she says she's glad to be here.
Oh, good, thank you.
So
again, I don't see the other hands. Is it okay? Am I interrupting anybody, Anne?
Nope, go ahead.
As you and I emailed back and forth about, I have a background in doing organizational consulting, and many of the concepts that you referred to, like double loop learning and all the work that Peter Senge did about fifth discipline, and all of that stuff is a part of that profession. It's basic foundational stuff. I'm curious about the field of law, and why is it that you think those principles are not embedded in law schools and legal practice? It would seem, and this is perhaps why you're so interested in it, it would seem sort of axiomatic that these techniques and principles would be foundational for the practice of law.
I know. Oh gosh, that's such a big question for me. I think I could write for days about that or talk for days about that. I mean, part of it is what I'm observing too within a law school environment about the difficulty of reflective and generative dialogue. I'm seeing it now there. I saw it in the clinic system I worked within, and we spent years trying to sort of shift that and be more open about sharing and coming in with new ideas, despite the fact we were always feeling threatened by funding cuts. But I see it in other places too. And I mean, one of the things I said in my dissertation was that we default to advocacy rather than reflective inquiry, and what a challenge that creates. I mean, I think the ideas are so rich. They are actually how I survived being a legal clinic ED when so much seemed to be executive director, when so much seemed to be against us in the world, our funders, the core. you know, the populations, everything. Like I was always trying to figure out, well, how do we create systems change? That's part of what we do. And I'm sure Nanette can totally resonate with that in her area of work. And I had to turn to the organizational learning literature. And I too thought, well, why aren't we talking about these ideas? You know, because they're ways of creating change too, right? And system dysfunction, what doesn't work. And oh my God, you're living that reality right now, as the rest of us are, as observers, but also related because the tariffs came into place on our country today. So there's so much going on that, yeah, I think it would be so helpful. But the question is like, how does it come in? I did meet someone in Australia who is bringing in Otto Scharmer's ideas, which are an extension of all that organizational learning literature. And I was like, oh my God, how are you doing this? You know, and I was just so inspired to meet someone who was trying to bring those ideas in, but he was in an institute or a research institute that was more peripheral to the everyday lives of law students, doing important work, but peripheral, right? And I did meet when I went to one of Scharmer's workshops in Boston. I mean, I did meet people connected to the UN, for example, who were in that workshop, some of whom had legal training, but you're not, I don't know. I don't know, what do other people think? I'm curious.
Lisa wants to join in the conversation.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm still trying to discern the difference between critical thinking and reflection. And I just got a hit. I can't say I reasoned my way through it, but in thinking about this question of how is reflection not a part of law, or is it? And
Yeah.
and I think one thing that occurs to me is that we're talking about a methodology that requires some kind of normative or value-oriented content, right? So reflection is a method, but what are we reflecting about? And what's probably lacking in law? So the reflection in law is, how do these rules, how do you apply these rules to these facts? What is the legal analysis and how do you advocate? And that does require some reflection if the value is winning a case. But if the value is to look at a system and question, for example, the historical, social, and economic inequalities, the reflection about that question will be very different. So it almost seems like a vessel, and something has to be imported into that vessel for it to actually make sense. And obviously in our conversation, our value or moral or whatever normative direction is, we want justice, spirit, you know all the values that we hold, but that's not going to be the same value for another group or another set of thinkers in the law. And so that's just occurring to me with this idea, because gosh, there's just so many ways that you're sharing reflection, realizing each of them has their goal. I'm going to share, it's just occurring to me. I saw a post on I don't know, LinkedIn, on the horrific meeting between Zelensky and Trump. And by the way, not that I had any control over the tariffs, but my sincere apologies for that. Many of us are just as distressed. But it was a game theory analysis of this poster was saying, oh, how brilliant Trump was, this chess player. And I was just like, I was really struggling with that comment. And I suddenly got like, well, what is the end game that you think he's getting at? Because your evaluation of the process is completely dependent on what you think is good. And if you think just winning by domination is good, yeah, maybe it was brilliant strategy. But if your value is, world peace and freedom and democracy, then it was a terrible strategy, right? So we can't really think about the methodology and the strategy without thinking about what are we aiming for? I don't know. That's just what's occurring to me as you've presented since last time.
So helpful, Lisa, too. And I'm thinking back again to Peter Gable's article, right? Law's legitimacy deriving from its relationship to justice. Post-liberal transformation is what's required, how we want to foster empathy, compassion, mutual understanding, right? And I don't know.
Because if justice is winning, that's going to be a
know.
different methodology than if justice is the elevation of all people, you know, the human
Exactly.
rights or, you know, yeah, like, so that I think you can't
Yeah,
look at the methodology without thinking about the values
exactly.
that are motivating it.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm sure most of us are motivated by ideas of both and, not either or, right? Not by win, lose, not even by fair, but by ideas that foster, you know, the better development of everybody who's on this planet together, including more than humans, right? Like, honestly, we have, that's my sense of this group from everything that I've read, right? It's a bigger vision of why we're here and what we're trying to do through law.
So Nanette has just posted Martin Luther King's statement, justice is love correcting that which revolts against love. And Jenny,
This for some reason, and I blame us. I think it's us, bro. It's like, bro, we can do the
Sorry.
and Jenny wants to come in.
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry, and just to correct it, it's justice is love, correcting that which revolts against love. I think we've got to mute somebody.
Go in on the fucking Zoom.
Nanette, can you mute?
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the participants list. I can't. Do we know who it is that we need to mute?
I think Chaplain,
Chaplain.
somebody who just joined. Okay.
Jenny.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And apologies in advance. I'm going to have to leave very soon, but this is a really interesting conversation. That one of the things that reminds me that I've been thinking a lot about reading materials for this More Than Human Rights conference I'm going to be going to in New York is that even in a group like ours, you can expect that there are going to be disagreements. And a lot of the stuff I was reading seemed to think, well, we all care about the environment, and so we're all going to choose the same kinds of, we're all going to think that biological integrity means this. And so one of the things that I'm struck by is the absence of figuring out how to take seriously conflict or disagreement, even among people who share broad goals. And so that seems like a piece. As we reflect, we will arrive at different places and sometimes really different places. And so the other, on why don't we see this in law schools? So, you know, I think really overwhelmingly law is there to maintain the status quo. And this is to disrupt the status quo. And there are a lot of different forms of it. Critical legal studies was another quite different form, but you know, that's not what law schools think they're doing by and large. And even I had a student who studied how people teach contracts, and even people who have very progressive ideas about law, when it comes to teaching, they default into very conventional modes of teaching. And there's powerful incentives for doing that, like using other people's notes. And anyway, there's a real kind of status quo in law schools. But so I wanted to just raise one other thing that I was struck by listening. I was recently at a workshop on animal law, protecting animals. And I was struck at about the different ways of thinking about it. Some people were trying to figure out how can we use existing law right now to overcome some of the terrible things that are happening. And so the language of rights is what's available. And so they're using rights for animals, and, you know, some of it is very creative. But other people, like me, are more interested in transforming law. And I think this more and more talk about rights in this new domain of nature and animals isn't going to take us where we want to go. I think we need the language of responsibility. And so there's a real, but I'm prepared to say, look, I'm not saying that thinking about how to rejig everything in terms of responsibility is right now going to save those pigs on the truck. So it's a good thing that there are other people doing what they're doing. I think of this, you know, many flowers blooming here. But I do think it's important to pay attention to what happens when you use tools that look like they're what's available. I honestly, I actually think back to, for years, I thought it was a sad legal history that Roe v. Wade had to use privacy as their language. It's obvious why they did it. That's what was there. It wasn't the best conceptual tool to talk about what's at stake in reproductive freedom. But you know, there it was. That's what was available. And so that's what they did. And I think it had long-term consequences. I don't think that's why we got it overturned. But anyway, so I think the scale of transformation one is after can be in tension with the objectives of getting something done now to stop real violence, real harm right now. And maybe both things are important to happen. I have to say one other really quick thing, Michele. In your ethics of care, you've got a really, really, really old quote there about preserving relationships. That is not what the ethic of it is a common old version of saying, but we know that the point is not to preserve existing relationships, right? It's to value relationships, it's to assess them, it's to understand them. So you ought to change that phrase.
Well, it's from those authors, sorry. I was using their materials there. I would do a broader bit, a whole broader thing on ethics of care. That
Yeah,
was
but
just
I would just get rid of that description because
okay.
most people don't subscribe to that
resonate with that.
anymore.
Super. Okay, well, thank you for that. And I'm really intrigued again by all your comments, because I think one of my whole pieces about reflective practice and reflective dialogue and the open mind, open heart, open will, and generative dialogue ideas that come from Adam Kahaney and also Otto Scharmer and others is this ability to listen to one another through difference and difficulty as a way of envisioning a different kind of future, right? It's part of that capacity to be able to do that, and not as we do often law advocate against each other for our ideas or whatever it is. It's a different spirit of reflective inquiry, right? And so my whole thread that one of the threads I hold is one on conflict transformation, not just resolution, but transformation in service of a greater good and other ideas that we haven't even imagined yet, right? Which gets me back to the ideas I said before about future forming reflection. Like, what does that look like to do that? And that's really quite exciting. And so, and again, so helpful. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at the learning retreat and having a few more conversations. Also very helpful. I know we probably need to wrap up now in terms of time, but it's been so helpful. Is there anyone else that I'm not, I can't see you all on my screen or the chat. Oh my God, there's more stuff in the chat. But Anne, anything else there before I just say my couple of last words and then go? Thank you so much.
Chaplain Boyd Willis has introduced himself in the chat. And his connection to the Georgia Justice Project, of whom he was a successful client. But I also want to say that one of the upcoming PISLAP talks by Herman Green will be about Earth law and will forward a lot of the themes that have recently been raised. And I think we do need to thank Michele and thank everybody for attending, and look at Michele, what Michele is creating in the present moment, and say goodbye until the next PISLAP conversation. Nanette, is there anything else you would like to add?
There's another thing I wanted to say. It relates to the Georgia Justice Project. Is that okay? Because Peter writes about that project also in his article that I referred to, right? And he talks about learning from the Georgia Justice Project, how we can aspire to help shape a generation of open-hearted lawyers capable of seeking spiritually informed justice. And I just wanted to, yeah.
So Chaplain Boyd has asked if he could to speak. So go ahead.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Hello, Chaplain Boyd is a female. My name
Okay.
is Chaplain Gwendell Boyd Willis.
Yes,
and
sorry for misgendering you.
That's okay. I was Georgia Justice Project helped me in January 2021. Governor Kemp of the state of Georgia passed the law of SB 288, before January 2021, nobody could get their criminal record pardoned or expunged. I was the first person that was able to get their criminal record pardoned and expunged. I was represented by the Georgia Justice Project, and they handled my case pro bono. You can Google my name. I've been on several platforms. USA Today. I was interviewed by the government, by the editor of the White House. Also, Yahoo Sports News, Atlanta Journal-Constitution. There's a full article on Black Enterprise. You can go to YouTube, and Georgia Justice Project has a documentary that they filmed as well. There's also a documentary on Black Enterprise. And I'm very familiar with what you all are talking about, because I have a criminal justice degree, a bachelor's in criminal justice. I also have 2 master's degrees. And I'm a certified chaplain. I did my studies with Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. And I just was glad that I was able to jump on with you all. I was in a meeting and I stepped out just to jump into you all's Zoom. And I will put my information in the chat if anyone wants to contact me and ask any questions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There will also be a recording of this presentation and of part 1, which will be circulated to people who are in attendance. And if you want to get announcements of other PISLAP presentations, Nanette, should she contact, go on the website? Okay, there's the link. So let's just take a moment to take a couple of easy, deep breaths. And take all of our energy out of the shared inquiry space that we have created and take it back to ourselves, because that's an important energetic practice. And we look forward to seeing you again in this forum and many other settings as the universe and our journeys evolve and develop.
Nanette, I think you're speaking, but we can't hear you.
Thank you. I was just expressing my thanks and appreciation to Michele for creating this wonderful 2-part series for us on reflective lawyering and on looking for the deeper thread. And may we all continue to do that. And if we think it's appropriate to do that, as Kim Vander Heiden pointed out. And thanks to Anne as well for her participation and in co-creating the event. And look forward to seeing everyone again. Herman Green will be speaking on Earth Law on April 7th at the same time. We'll send out an announcement and we'll send out Michele's slides, right, Michele? Or
yeah, I'll send us. Yeah, I'll send.
Yeah,
it, yeah,
afterwards.
today's version. Yeah, super.
All right.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Be well.